Hey, welcome back to the Health Bridge. Dr. Pedram here again with a kind of a racy subject. We're talking about narcissism, and the first word that comes to mind with narcissism is woo, right? And it's something that we judge, right? We judge narcissists. And so one of the fastest rising searches on Google actually is, what is narcissism? Articles on the topic routinely go viral, and I'm starting to wonder. I go on camera twice a week with the series The Health Bridge and The Urban Monk. And does it make sense for me to talk about this? Does that make me a narcissist? I'm on camera all the time. So I'm hoping today's guest, the author of the book, Rethinking Narcissism, can help sort that out. Dr. Craig Malkin is an author, clinical psychologist, and instructor of psychology for Harvard Medical School with 2 decades of experience helping individuals, couples, and families. His articles advise on insights on relationships have appeared in Psychology Today, Time, Women's Health, Men's Health, and the Huffington Post. I'm really excited about this, Doc. Welcome to the Health Bridge. And so why so much in the current literature on narcissism? Is it an epidemic? I mean, what's going on here?
A couple pieces to your question that we need to address. First of all, there's the whole question of what is narcissism.
Yeah.
When most of us think of the word narcissism or narcissist, we have this image of a vain, preening, primping, boastful braggart, reality TV types. And so first we kind of have to talk about what narcissism isn't and what narcissists aren't, because not all narcissists care about looks or fame or money, and some can be extremely quiet. So if you get too focused on that image, which is really a caricature, you miss signs of danger, even that have nothing to do with vanity or greed, and more reliable signs that can help you understand and cope with what's going on in a relationship. I really spent the first 3/4 of Rethinking Narcissism talking about what's bad about narcissism in a different way. But this second piece, the second half to of an answer to your question is really beginning in 1980, there was a book called The Culture of Narcissism by Christopher Lasch. And that's where the word first really burst onto the scene for the general population. And people were fascinated with it because basically he said, we have a narcissistic culture of people obsessed with materialism, and it's really taking over. And he was really talking particularly about Western and culture in America. And then there was a second wave around 2008, 2009, when a group of researchers, including a psychologist named Jean Twenge, declared that there was a narcissism epidemic. Based on research that she had looked at and evidence that she had gathered. The short answer to the second part of your question is no, I don't believe there is a narcissism epidemic.
Let's get into the classic definition of narcissism. You teach this at Harvard. What is a narcissist? How do you identify someone who has narcissism?
It's an excellent question, because the first thing to understand is that narcissist is not a diagnosis. It never has been. Even some people in the mental health profession often use narcissist and narcissistic personality disorder, which we can touch on synonymously, but they're not the same thing. Narcissist simply means someone higher than average in traits of narcissism, and that's usually measured by a standard measure of some kind. The narcissistic personality inventory is one of them, but there are a number of measures out there. And you give people the measure, and if they score well above average, they are called narcissists. They may or may not be disordered. And if you look at the research, in fact, there are many people who score high enough to be narcissists who never actually reached a level of disorder. In fact, there's a number of studies that show that the vast majority of politicians and presidents score high enough on measures to be narcissists. It's just that there are healthy and unhealthy aspects to narcissism, and we have begun to tease them apart in the research.
So you've got a scale. Let's just say the left side of the scale would be utter selflessness. You're Mother Teresa. Yep. You're the Buddha. You don't have any ego at all. You're just out there serving. And then the other side, all the way to the right, would be total arrogance. And so is that basically like, is it the 50-yard line over? Like where does narcissism start there, and how do we kind of find ourselves on that map?
So again, the traditional spectrum, a lot of people have talked about a spectrum of narcissism. It's often been written about and researched. It's usually thought of as degrees of awful. Like you sort of start out as, vaguely obnoxious, and then you go up from there all the way to narcissistic personality disorder. You gave some examples at the lower end. What I wanted to do, and what I and my colleagues wanted to do, is to bring things together in a way that makes sense, because we now have 4 different measures of healthy narcissism. There's our own measure called healthy narcissism, and you can think of this as having slightly rose-colored glasses for yourself and for others, and I'll get into that in a minute. There's actually, on the narcissistic personality inventory, it falls into 3 piles mathematically. One is called leadership authority. It only correlates with positive things. There's another measure called the narcissistic admiration and rivalry questionnaire, cleverly, the NARC. And the admiration piece is the healthy piece. Think of it as a capacity to admire and be admired. What we know about all of these is that healthy and unhealthy narcissism do not rise and fall in step with one another, not perfect steps. So it's possibly high in one, extremely low in the other. The other thing that we know is that for really over a quarter of a century, we've had evidence that most people around the world, including not just, again, Western countries like the UK, like America, but China, most people feel a little bit special, exceptional, or unique, not average. And that when we feel a little bit special, it helps us feel more resilient, persist in the face of failure. In our research, people were better able to give and receive in relationships. That's healthy narcissism. It's those rose-colored glasses. So you want to think of narcissism instead of just as like this obnoxious personality trait as a pervasive universal drive, the drive to feel special. What we know is that when people lack those rose-colored glasses, and I don't know that Mother Teresa necessarily did, and the Buddha, remember, talked about balance. So on the end of people who lack the rose-colored glasses, who never feel special at all, I dubbed that echoism, because Echo, in the myth of Narcissus and Echo was the nymph who was cursed to repeat back the last few words that she heard. She had no voice of her own. And like people who struggle with echoism, or I should say like Echo, people who struggle with echoism tend to fall into relationships with extremely narcissistic partners. This is why another major rethink in Rethinking Narcissism, I wanted to help empower people who struggle with relationships precisely because they lack those rose-colored glasses. So instead of the degrees of obnoxious in my revision of the spectrum, what my colleagues and I did was we envisioned, okay, on one end we have that lack of healthy narcissism, echoism. In the middle is where you find healthy narcissism, the rose-colored glasses. And then at the far right, as people become more and more extreme, more and more dependent on or addicted to feeling special, they become narcissists and even might develop narcissistic personality disorder. So that's the spectrum.
Interesting. So, we live in a world that's colored by the screens on our TVs. And so you see, say, the Kardashians, you see some of these people that, get away with anything. Some of these athletes, Deflategate, whatever you want to look at. And these people feel like they're above the law. They feel like everyone's looking at them. And so how much of that is unhealthy narcissism, kind of clinically speaking, and how much of that is just kind of silly showmanship that doesn't qualify?
Oh, it's a great question, because and what it gets to the heart of is this whole controversy. I, as a clinician, we as clinicians cannot diagnose anyone with narcissistic personality disorder if we've never been in the room with them. So it's anybody's guess. If you don't know the person's private life, how much of it is show, how much of it is sort of playing to the camera, that can be instrumental. It can be a means to an end. It might not necessarily be the core of who the person is, but I would say the behavior itself is what we need to focus on. And as soon as somebody is so strongly dependent, remember, I think the best way to think about it is this. Again, we have a universal tendency, drive to feel special. When people are uncomfortable sharing vulnerability, being able to say when they're sad or scared or lonely, and turning to somebody with that, one special persons or people for comfort and care, they're more likely to depend on feeling special. And just like with any addiction, somebody who's addicted to a substance, they might lie, steal, cheat, do whatever it takes to get their high. This is what you want to look out for in answer to your question. We don't know what their private life is like, but it's really the core of pathological narcissism. Unhealthy narcissism is what I call triple E. Exploitation, that is doing whatever it takes to get your needs met, no matter what the cost. Entitlement, acting as if the world and other people owe you. And empathy impairment, which is where you're so focused on whatever your internal preoccupation is, or that need to stand out from the other 7 billion people on the planet, that you can't see or hear the person in front of you clearly. You become you essentially become emotionally tone deaf. It's triple E, which is the core of pathology. So if you're looking for boxes to check for people you see on TV, politicians, reality TV stars, those are the boxes that you want to look at.
Interesting. So lack of empathy is a big one. And we've all met that person, right? Where you're in a conversation and they're waiting for you to shut up so they could go back to talking about what they were talking about. And they're not listening. They're not engaged in a two-way conversation. They're already thinking about their response. And I think we all are guilty of that to a certain degree. But the first one you mentioned actually kind of can veer towards psychopathy, right? And so how far do you go in your first E before you could say, okay, well, this person is a psychopath, right?
What happens is the more you see, originally people thought of the core of pathological or unhealthy narcissism as EE. That's exploitation, entitlement. So your question is dead on. The reality is, the more people show those traits, again, you can see how empathy begins to slip away. But the more people show that capacity for exploitation and entitlement, then they start to even overlap with psychopathy, which is a pattern of remorseless lies and manipulation. That's really the best way to think about it. And it can even cluster into something very dangerous called the dark tetrad. At the extreme, the dark tetrad is narcissism, which we've already talked about, psychopathy, Machiavellianism, which is a cutthroat, do whatever it takes personality, and sadism, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's that taking delight in other people's pain. If you want a great sort of iconic example of a dark tetrad personality, just think of House from TV's House MD.
And how much does that help get that into the kind of the popular culture and the memes, seeing these types of people? Like I watch, and I'm no clinical psychologist, so you can correct me on my amateurish diagnosis here, but I watch House of Cards and I say, well, this is interesting to me because it helps me understand a psychopath or a sociopath's behavior more likely, right? And so I'm watching sociopathy and I'm becoming aware of it, but then I would catch myself feeling like I can be a sociopath. Like, how much of it gets influenced by what you've seen and how that becomes the new norm in TV? I think that's what most parents are scared about.
Well, I think people have all kinds of concerns. Really, what you're talking about is modeling, and that's something I even talk about in Rethinking Narcissism. Is when we're exposed to these figures, when we're exposed to this kind of behavior again and again. But anybody who has concerns about it, I mean, if you have self-awareness, like you said, you worry about those traits in yourself. We all have. This is why we have this idea of traits. And a spectrum is to capture the idea that we all have this to some extent. It's in the extreme that things become a problem. And if we're worried at all about, am I tipping into psychopathy with the amount that I'm sort of presenting myself to some effect and trying to win people over, self-awareness, and again, this is something I go over and over again in Rethinking Narcissism to help people understand what's at the core of this and what helps. To the extent that we can depend on people, we will not depend on feeling special. It won't become addictive.
Interesting.
Because what we find in the research is that people have what's called secure attachment, which is that capacity when we're sad or scared or lonely to turn to people for care and comfort and feel comfortable doing that, depending on others in emotionally healthy ways. People who have that capacity, they have the rose-colored glasses, right? They have the healthy narcissism, but they do not go into the extreme. This shows up again and again. If they have the capacity, so if you're at all worried, do I need to keep this in check? You need to work on authentic, open, mutually caring relationships, because that's what keeps it in check.
It's a challenge in this world where, kids move out when they're 18, they go get their own apartment, and they work their 2 jobs if they have to, and really people are getting lonelier and lonelier, and so we're becoming more and more isolated, and we don't have that kind of extended tribe to lean into and trust and communicate with, and so walking around playing Pokemon Go or trapped on your social media. How much of that is replacing the real authentic relationships that we need in order to have that safety net?
I think time will tell, but I think what we know, based on what we know from the research, it gives us a clear direction for how to make sure people stay healthy. I mean, I would like to see in the schools, there's enough evidence of this that I would like to see in the schools, part of the curriculum, just teaching people, if you are spending all your time doing what I call image churning, just tagging yourself in pictures and cleaning up your profile picture and changing it again and again. If you're doing things like that really just are about calling attention to yourself, you don't have the capacity to connect with others. If you're in the midst of doing Pokemon Go, not spending any time talking to people about what's really going on inside of you and finding ways to share that, these are the things that keep us healthy, then you can easily become lost in sort of addictive gaming. I mean, it's a really helpful model just to think in general. Extreme narcissism is just one way of coping with that incapacity or that fear, that insecurity about depending on people. We can soothe ourselves with drugs. We can soothe ourselves addictively with Pokemon Go, or you can soothe yourself with feeling special. And as I said in Rethinking Narcissism, I wanted to break that stereotype because we know there are lots of ways to feel special. Some people feel special by being the most misunderstood person in the room. Something I call introverted narcissism, also often called hypersensitive or vulnerable. It's a term I don't like. If we can get into that why if you want. But these are people who agree with statements like, I'm temperamentally different from other people, and most people don't understand my problems. Yep. Introverted narcissism. So they feel special for their pain. You can see this on nothing to do with self-esteem or vanity. There's a new type of narcissism in the research, communal narcissism, people who agree with statements like, I'm the most helpful person I know, who actually agree with that statement. Lots of ways to feel special, lots of ways to soothe yourself that have nothing to do with what we often call co-regulation in relationships, where it actually it calms our nervous system. It changes our ability to manage difficult feelings when we feel like we can connect with others. So I think it's a cautionary note. We know what helps people, and we have to make sure that we're educating anybody not to get so isolated because that's where these problems start to occur.
Well, and before we know it, people are that isolated, which is the challenge in our world, right? You start to, you start to notice that they're being a little different. Maybe the world has failed them. Maybe they've drawn up a narrative that, I got to go it on my own. No one's ever been there for me, and then that starts to build this personality that becomes a disorder over time.
Absolutely, yes. What you're describing is pretty. I think you used the word classic or classic narcissist earlier. This is the more extroverted type, more outgoing, and really their core in all people who struggle with extreme narcissism, no matter what form it takes, are afraid to depend on people. But extroverted narcissists sort of go to the extreme of, I don't need anyone or anything. I am perfectly self-sufficient. And the reason they take that stance is, if I am everything and you are nothing and have nothing to offer me, then I never even have to feel tempted to depend on anyone. I'm perfectly self-contained. That is definitely the level of disorder. A lot of people who are extremely narcissistic, so much so that they can be diagnosed, they have that core triple E, and they can be diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder when they're very grandiose. It's almost as if other people and the world really doesn't matter to them.
I've actually seen this in people who are all alone minus one conviction, where they feel like their personal relationship with God is all they need, yet they act in all the similar ways, and it's just like, God's going to provide everything and you people are useless. And I've seen them in like religious orders where it's like, wow, that's a very challenging stance that you've got there, but they, their conviction is there and they're stuck there. Do you see that with like religious people, or does that go into some other category?
I think you can see a version of, yes, that's the kind of dismissiveness that you see with a really classic, outgoing, narcissistic people who rise to the level of disorder. They can wind up addictively and destructively using their sense of their spirituality. There's a kind of grandiosity to the spirituality, and that has nothing to do with really being close to people. Sometimes they have a holier than thou attitude, but I often say anything that's potentially good for us can be used either adaptively or defensively. We can use religion and spirituality to lock the world out if we want. And then there are other people who use their spirituality and their religion, their religious beliefs, more along the lines of a communal narcissist, who are very much, I'm the most helpful person I know. You're so selfish and misguided if you don't recognize what a giving, caring person I am. They don't necessarily give much thought to what's going on inside themselves or you. So religion can capture people or can pull people in who are drawn to that way of coping as well. It's only as healthy as our use of it.
Yeah, amazing. Yet a lot of it goes unexplored, and because it falls under the auspices of religion, unquestioned, right? And so I know that there's a good percentage of people listening to this that feel that they are living with a narcissist, whether they are, truly narcissistic, disorder, or someone who's kind of, on that spectrum. What does one do when they feel like they're living with someone like that? They can't communicate with them and they can't get it across. That seems to be a huge challenge culturally.
Yeah, the first thing I recommend is making sure you're safe. We can talk. Let me answer that in two pieces, and then maybe I can go back to you. But the first piece is you need to look for what I call the early warning signs. Remember I said narcissism, extreme narcissism can be very subtle. Not everybody is overtly abusive or even abusive. Sometimes they're just arrogant, aloof in ways that make you feel like you're alone in the relationship, even when you're in the same room with the person. But what all extremely narcissistic people have in common, whether they reach the level of disorder or not, remember, is they are afraid to depend on people. And that means that there are tells that show up. So let me just give one, which is really common, which is I call playing emotional hot potato. You want to think of this like playing hot potato, only with feelings of insecurity. I don't want to feel this way, here, you take it. Now, we all tend to do these things from time to time, but the more narcissistic someone is, the more they do them frequently, and they use all of these strategies. I go over 5 strategies in Rethinking Narcissism, but this is just one. So an example would be I had a client who was applying to graduate school, and her boyfriend was very unsure of where he was in life and what he was doing, and he wasn't talking about that. So instead, what he would do is sort of look over her shoulder and say, "You're sure that's the school that you want to apply to? Doesn't it seem like overreaching a little bit?" And so this was his way of sort of shoring up his feeling that he was in the know, when in fact he was actually feeling very unsure of himself. At the same time, it undermined her sense of her certainty and her feelings of self-confidence. That is what I call playing emotional hot potato. These, again, and it's a way of avoiding vulnerability. I don't want to feel vulnerable. I don't want to feel like I don't know what I'm doing. I don't want to feel like I'm not sure of myself and my place in life. Here, I'm going to say and do things that make you feel it. So that's playing emotional hot potato. I want to go back to you, and then maybe I can answer about what to do.
Yeah, no, I'd love to know what to do, because there's so many people listening to this right now that have that in their lives. That person is in their lives in one way or another.
So the second part of it is if you see things like this, you also want to just make sure you're safe. So this is where I recommend looking out for what I call the 3 stop signs. And I go into more detail of this in Rethinking Narcissism and in other places where I've talked about it. But briefly, the 3 stop signs are ongoing emotional abuse and physical abuse. It doesn't matter what causes it, whether it's extreme narcissism or subtle narcissism or alcoholism or any possible cause. Lots of things cause somebody to be abusive. If you're in a relationship where somebody's being abusive, you can't feel safe enough to take the kind of risks to test out whether or not there's any hope for change. In fact, my wife and I do couples therapy. When there's abuse, we won't see the people together. There has to be some commitment for a person to end their abusive behavior first. And I want to say this to everyone out there, because I think this is the most important message. It is the abuser who is 100% responsible for their abuse. You can't get caught up in the trap of thinking, if I say or do things differently, maybe they won't treat me this way. Only one person can stop the abuse, and that is somebody who's abusive. The second stop sign is denial. If you're with somebody who can't even acknowledge in some small way that there's something they're struggling with, say, I think I've got a problem here, whether they go to therapy or not, they can't acknowledge they struggle. Nothing can get better, no matter what the problem is. Again, whether it's gambling addiction or alcohol abuse, if somebody can't acknowledge it, they're not going to change. That relationship can't get better. And then the third we've already touched on, which is psychopathy, a pattern of remorseless lies and manipulation, where people sort of repeatedly lie straight to your face without really flinching. If you see any of these 3 stop signs, your primary goal has to be to restore your emotional and physical safety. And you want to talk to a professional about what kind of things will help you figure out how to leave, what gets in the way of your leaving, because that it's not a relationship that can improve, and you really need to find a way to restore your safety.
I know a lot of people who get trapped there because they said, well, I stood in the church and we took these vows till death do us part, and now he gets drunk and he gets abusive now and again, and I deal with it, and so they're stuck in this kind of like oath that they took. And when they hear about these 3 stop signs, it really puts them into some dissonance, right? And so they're not safe. It's a challenge.
They're not safe. They're not safe. And what I would say to anybody in that position is, you took an oath. You have to ask yourself, is your partner still living by that oath?
Mm. Mm.
Because part of entering into that bond of marriage, entering into that bond of partnership, is feeling like you can put yourself in the other person's hands and be safe and be respected, and you can trust yourself in their hands. And without that, the oath has been broken, I would argue, but not by you.
Yeah, thank you for that. So now, there's this healthy side to this that I do want to tease out a little bit, in that, we have this, I have a son, and like my parents come over, my mom treats him like the prince, and this guy gets away with everything, but it's like they're building up his ego strength, they're building up his confidence,
Yes.
they're rosing up his glasses type of thing, and to a certain extent that's helpful, right? It gives him resilience in a crazy world that's always knocking you down. And so how do we look at this healthier side? How do we rethink narcissism for our children and for ourselves?
Another excellent question, because the over and over again, you probably even heard that it's telling our kids that they're special, leaving them feeling overvalued or special, that's what creates extremely narcissistic children or generation, and that is not what does it. I'm going to reiterate what I said because it is such an important point. We already know from the research what it is that tips people into extremely narcissistic behavior. You can tell a kid they're special over and over again. It's not going to do a thing except help them with those rose-colored glasses. It's part of feeling, we want to feel special to the people who love us. That's part of secure attachment, and that's what gives us the rose-colored glasses. And very often when it comes to our kids, we're like, yeah, they're the best ever, and they're my prince, or they're my princess. One of my favorite scenes from a book or a movie is in a Little Princess. And it's where this girl who gets separated from her father, later on you find out that actually they're afraid he's died in the war. She's in the care of other people, and she's having a chat with one of her caretakers. And she's telling her all about how her father called her princess, and the woman's correcting her. And she's saying, but all little girls should be princesses to their fathers. All of them, whether they're pretty or whether they have beautiful clothes or whether they're poor, all of them should feel like princesses. Didn't your father teach you that? Didn't he? And that belief actually helped her. That sense of feeling special to someone in the world helped her through years until she was able to be reunited with her father, to feel some sense of hope. So how do you keep it in check? Well, if you are talking to your children about their feelings when they're sad or scared or lonely, if you are modeling feeling, I go through 8 keys based on the research in Rethinking Narcissism to help make sure that if it's this sort of slightly overly positive image of ourselves that is healthy narcissism, it's often called self-enhancement in the research, that it stays healthy. And one of those, and a couple of those keys include modeling vulnerability. If you are struggling because something is upsetting you, you lost a pet. Example I give in the book is I'm feeling sad because our cat Pyewacket died, and that's why mommy is feeling sad, and that's why you see her crying sometime, and you explain that and you talk about that. Or if you're reading to them about characters in a book, ask them, what are the characters feeling? Why are they feeling it? Why do you imagine they're feeling that? This is also called empathy coaching. And there's no surer way to keep narcissism in check than by teaching children empathy. So I go through all this in detail. My message, another important message to people, if you're a parent, don't worry about whether telling your kids special or calling them princess or prince, as long as you are teaching them that it is safe to depend on people emotionally. They can't become extremely narcissistic. You have to be insecurely attached to become extremely narcissistic. You have to be afraid to depend on others.
So connecting, showing empathy, showing love, showing vulnerability, and modeling all these really human traits is a big part of making sure that these safeguards are built in, because narcissism just kind of shunts out to that extreme, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It seems to be a part of us. That's what I want to explain in ways that make sense. There's even research that you look at little kids, preschoolers, they ask them after they've done absolutely miserably on a test, they've failed it horribly. How are you going to do on this test tomorrow? And up to a certain age, I think it's something like 6 maybe, they'll say, "Oh, I'm going to do fantastic." But if you ask them if the broken toy that they have is going to be broken tomorrow, they'll say, "Yeah, it's going to be broken tomorrow." So what researchers have pointed out, that there's no cognitive explanation. It's not a developmental thing that these kids are saying they're going to do great on a test even after they've done horribly. It's that kids, that we probably need that sense to help keep us going. And maybe adults need a little of this now and then, when just to kind of help get them past that stage where they're sort of trying to dream beyond the moment. One of the questions that loaded most highly on our measure of healthy narcissism was, "I like to dream big, but not at the expense of my relationships." I love that. It's fascinating. Extremely narcissistic people did not agree with that question at all. That did not resonate for them. So, it might be a part of us that, and especially in childhood, it's like children are natural narcissists in that sense, without all the nasty qualities, because otherwise they would feel horrible because they fail every day. They're growing.
That's amazing. Yeah, every time they try to stand up and walk for the first little bit.
Yeah. Every day is a failure.
Interesting. And every day is a learning lesson from those failures.
Yes.
So that's you look at some of the anecdotes of, say, Gandhi and Mother Teresa, and kind of going full circle to where we started. Some of the people that were closest to them thought that they were absolutely unsufferable, intolerable people. They were isolated. They were really hard to be around. They would snap. They were just not who their external persona was. And it's probably because, and I met a lot of gurus along those lines, where, you get to a point where now you're the guru and you can't be vulnerable with the people around you. So who the hell are you going to vent with? Who are you going to talk to in order to have human attachment and some of that discharge of the angst that we all have in this world?
Absolutely. It's very dangerous. And yeah, the guru syndrome. So some of myself and some of my colleagues have called it. Maybe that's a common term. But yeah, interestingly, I had some conversations with people involved in the military, where we were trying to think about, how do you think about these problems when it comes to leadership in the military. And one of the things I pointed out, and this is getting to your point, it's kind of like they need, if didn't want Gandhi to be so insufferable to the people closest to him, he needed a community of gurus.
Yep.
You've got to have, even if it's a matter of, I need to present in a certain way for people to have their faith in me, and I think that can be taken too far, actually. But even if that's the case, it might be especially adaptive, say, in the military, where they have to have absolute certainty, whether they're certain or not. There are certain situations where that kind of grandiosity is important and adaptive. But if it's just you, as they say, it's lonely at the top, you can easily spin off in the direction where it becomes very unhealthy, and you're not having authentic connections with people. So one of the recommendations I made in this discussion about leadership in the military is, let them have peers. I mean, if they can't talk to the people they're leading, they can at least talk to other generals. They can talk to other higher-ranking officers. I mean, that's the kind of thing that's going to help. But you have to create communities.
Yeah, which is something that the Western world is struggling with. And the news doesn't make it any easier, right? I mean, things are blowing up everywhere. The world's a crazy place. And so we all feel scared. And we all feel like the world is crazy. But if you don't have someone to talk to about that, That's a problem, and that's going to start feeding a different beast, which is, I think, one that shouldn't be fed too much in a world with 7 billion people. Chances are you could find a friend and you could find a peer. It can't be that lonely.
Right. And if you struggle to find that friend or find that peer, so that you can have some sense of security. And again, some people can do it in a healthy way through religious community or spiritual community. It's possible to have a secure attachment to a religious community. But you need to find it somewhere. Otherwise, you're in danger of slipping into the self-denying state of egoism or the self-aggrandizing state of extreme narcissism.
I love it. I think that this is a very refreshing conversation, and I thank you for bringing it to light. I know the book is out in paperback now. It's been doing its rounds. It's a great book. It's been doing wonderful for the people who have been in the circles reading it. And it's called Rethinking Narcissism. Dr. Craig Malkin. I find this to be a refreshing conversation, and I love the work that you're doing. How can people follow your work more? I mean, the book, I'm assuming, is for sale wherever books are up for sale.
Exactly. So you can also, I have not to give everything away for free, but I have a ton of free stuff on my website, more articles and videos. So you can find me at drcraigmalkin.com, drcraigmalkin as in Nancy.com. You can find me on Twitter. I share a ton on Twitter and often am responsive to people's questions. Also at Dr. Craig Malkin. Facebook is Dr. Craig Malkin. I try to make it easy on people. And I have a YouTube channel as well, where I just rolled out a whole series of videos answering people's questions in an event. I held a live event in honor of to celebrate the paperback launch and everybody's support at Dr. Craig Malkin /Real Narcissists.
Great.
Where people talk about all their experiences with narcissistic people in their life, and I have a series of 6 videos on YouTube where I answer all those questions.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. You don't have to be doing all that, and you are. So thank you for that. That's a hell of a lot of work. I know it. That's great. And I'll, for those of you who are listening, go there. If you have trouble, we'll put links in the blog post on well.org, and we'll make sure that you can find your way to Dr. Malkin and get the book, Rethinking Narcissism. Really interesting subject matter. I thank you for your time. I know you're busy over there at Harvard, and you're fighting the good fight. So I really appreciate what you're doing.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.